Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Margaret Bilo, and I will be your host for a series of interviews as we explore how this coronavirus is impacting surgical services. As we all know, for the past several weeks, our global community is struggling to respond to this COVID-19 pandemic. As this pandemic spreads, the demands on our healthcare systems are forcing us to manage our resources and deliver healthcare very differently. As we are forced to relook at our systems, many of our long-standing systems, as we know, are breaking down and can't meet the immediate needs in this crisis. As a result, surgical services, as we once knew it, is really coming to a screeching halt. Many of us are trying to figure out how to deploy resources, including people and personnel, in very unexpected ways. As this information is changing daily, it's essential for us to understand how we can utilize this unique subset of providers and resources and redirect them for the greater good. The purpose of this series of interviews is to share wisdom from the frontline leaders and prevent this or slow the spread of this virus, in addition to preserving our healthcare providers on the front line. Ultimately, we are rebuilding systems as we move through this process, and sharing this information is going to prove to be invaluable in the coming months. I'm calling upon the most seasoned perioperative leaders across the country to highlight strategies and pull from their lessons learned as we create this resource group to help us manage this COVID-19 pandemic. And I thank Whitman Partners for hosting this series of interviews as we build our community stronger and facing this pandemic. Today, I welcome Kathy Beidler. Kathy comes to us as an experienced nurse with over 20 years of leadership experience in surgical services and also business operations. She's an educator, an author, a keynote speaker, and a blogger. In addition to her business and nursing expertise, she is so deeply committed to enhancing the patient and family experience throughout their healthcare journey. Her theme of humanity in healthcare really rings true right now, as both our frontline providers are struggling. As leaders, we're working through our humanistic approach on how we care for patients, and we're reinventing systems and processes on the fly. So please join me in welcoming Kathy Beidler.
Thank you, Peg. And thank you to Whitman Partners for hosting this podcast series. And I just, as a little bit of background, and thank you, Peg, for all the information that you provided. I have been a nurse more years than I really want to tell you. I've been a nurse for more than 30 years. I was a teacher before I became a nurse. So that dates me a little bit. I used to teach 5th grade before I went back to nursing school. But I've been a peri-op nurse for more than 30 years. And as you mentioned, Peg, more than 20 of those have been spent in leadership positions, either as an educator, as a manager, as the director of surgery, as the administrator of 2 surgery centers. And now, in this part of my career, in addition to speaking and writing, I really enjoy doing interim director of surgery positions, which is what I've been doing most recently. The biggest change to my career came several years ago when I became a patient. You know, when you go in for elective surgery as a surgery nurse, you kind of know everything that can go wrong. And everything that could go wrong did go wrong with the surgeries that I had. I went in for an elective colon resection, and after 6 months, 6 months of recuperation, I had 4 surgeries in 5 months, 2 of which were emergent surgeries. And I tell you, I came out with a renewed passion for patient care and the care of their families. And I cannot tell you strongly enough how that impacted how I manage, how I take care of patients, how I see the environment. I look at everything from the lens of the staff and from the lens of the patient and how that impacts the patient. And what that ended up bringing to me in so many ways was the desire to mentor the staff and to really encourage them. You know, we're not encouraged enough and none of us are really. And I can speak specifically to nursing and working in the operating room. We get a lot of negatives, but we don't get a lot of positives. And I really believe that's missing in our landscape and our environment today. So what I learned from that, and this is part of my life growing up, my father was a very positive influencer to me. He was a great encourager to me, to my husband, to my children. He's passed away several years ago now. But I really believe in mentoring staff and encouraging them. So that's where I'm at in my career, and that's probably the thing that's most important to me. And seeing things from the humanity of healthcare and what that means to patients, what that means to staff, what that also means to physicians and anesthesia providers and administrators of the hospital as well.
That's very profound. And I can't think of a more relevant time to integrate, your wisdom as we try and navigate this. Now, you really touched on something, the mentoring staff. And as I look at the news, they're showing not only experienced staff that's struggling, but they have new residents that are have just hit the line after they graduated, or first responders, and people are trying to learn as they go along.
Yeah.
Do you have any, insight or things to offer that would help other perioperative leaders as they see this interview, that maybe, tips and tricks that could help them mentor the staff in this time of crisis?
The thing that I've learned during this COVID crisis, and what has been reinforced with me during this COVID crisis, is to look at each person as an individual, whether it's the patient, whether it's the anesthesiologist, because they have a whole different set of things to be concerned about, certainly, than we do. They're the ones that are, for the most part, are intubating the patients and have the most exposure. But it's also looking at our staff and what are the challenges that they have, and the physicians, and then supporting each other as leaders. And part of what I've done during emergencies, either in the COVID crisis, both in the COVID crisis and then also in other emergency situations, is to become very calm. And, as we do very well in the operating room, things can be absolutely crazy. Not that that would ever happen, right? But things can be absolutely crazy. But when something happens in the operating room, people focus. It becomes very quiet. And we assume our roles and don't have to say a whole lot. But the things that I've learned over these 30 years is, if I'm helping somebody during a crisis, is to be very calm and to get, if you and I were here together and we're working together and I'm very close standing by to you, I will be probably talking in your ear, and I'll probably be saying, you know what, we've got this. Here's what we need to do. You're doing a great job. This is where we are, and we've got it together. We can do this together. Very similar to, we had a code not too long ago, and it went really well. You get this sixth sense as an OR nurse, as particularly, you mentioned the word seasoned, Peg, and that tickles me because I always say I'm a seasoned nurse, which keeps me from saying I've been doing this so long I'm just old. But I am a seasoned nurse, and so I had a particular feeling about this case, and I know that you can identify with this, and the people that are listening to this can identify as well, because I just walked into a room. Something told me to walk into this one room, and I walked in, and I just had a sense that something was not, just about not to go well. A trocar was put in. The trocar was put into the patient's abdomen, and the physician said, "We need to get a new camera." And I'm thinking, we do not need to get a new camera. We need to open this patient. And sure enough, I'm Southern, so I would say sure enough, he made the decision that we were going to have to open that patient. That comes from being a seasoned nurse. And so I went to anesthesia, immediately and said, what do you need? How can I help you? And it's the same thing with the COVID crisis, supporting each other, saying to the director of the emergency room or the ED, what do you need? How can I help you? What do you need to our staff? How can I help you? And being there to encourage them, being right in their ear, being that encouraging word. And I was there to that anesthesiologist saying, you've got this. And that those unspoken words that go with the actions with each other, that they're going to have to put it in an art line, so you're going to have to help them position the hand for the art line. It's the same hand-in-hand thing that goes with the COVID crisis, knowing the untold things that need to be said, whether it's with body language or whether it becomes verbal. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I think that has really been reinforced even more so with this COVID crisis with me.
Thank you. That's really profound, because I was trying to pull the pieces apart and understand, what are some tried and true leadership skills that work in any crisis, because you and I have been in this business long enough that we have experienced multiple, unwanted crisis, but we figured out how to manage through it.
Right.
So you just clearly demonstrated and articulated these tried and true leadership skills, that at the elbow support, that encouragement, and in being in real time. And I also think another piece of that is, well, you didn't label it like that, it's clearly the visibility. The
right.
visibility of a leader. I always say that I think staff feel that a visible leader is a caring leader. And thank you for outlining those tried and true leadership skills that translate into any crisis. The opposite end of that question that I would pose to you now is, how is COVID different? Is this different from any other experience that you've had in your career? I sure know and hear stories that others are seeing that it's different. And so how do we step back and filter through that?
It's very different. I mean, very, very different from anything I've experienced in my nursing career. When we had the Ebola crisis, we had, I say we, not me, but the infection preventionist at the hospital, at the surgery center, whomever, had those areas set up in preparation for the Ebola crisis, but we never saw an Ebola patient. That is 180 degrees different than where we are with the coronavirus. We have at the hospital where I just was, they were very proactive in setting things up, just as it was with Ebola. However, we're seeing these coronavirus patients with very steady numbers. And either they're presenting with symptoms, and they had them in a triage area, which was a tent that was set up, which was very smart on their part. They started their incident command center early, probably earlier than a lot of other places did. So they would see them in the triage area of the ER, and then they were able to isolate the patients that presented with COVID symptoms. We just didn't have that, at least in the areas where I've worked across the country. We didn't see Ebola patients. Not that they weren't there, but this is not something that's remote to us. It's right here with us. And the preparation for Ebola, while the preparation was good, for the most part, it was good. This preparation is very much ongoing, changes daily, changes multiple times during the day. And then that part, plus the part of educating the staff, because the things that we would learn early in the day would change what we did the rest of the day. Then we would learn things in the afternoon meeting, and that would change what we did the rest of the day and then for the next morning. So it's very different than anything that I've seen, at least in my career.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The keeping abreast of the changes and figuring out how to translate that into your current environment is
Right.
definitely, it adds that additional layer of stress. So you talked about, two things. I liked, can you share any strategies or things that you put in place specific to the COVID-19 that you learned, whether from the WHO or the CDC or something that was really unexpected for you in surgical services? For instance, I'm hearing of them converting operating room suites into ICU units. Our PACUs are functioning now as step-down units, or we're using ventilators differently.
Right.
Staff, the OR nurses are being deployed differently. What have you seen any of this, and what steps did you put in place to help communicate how these people are going to live a different life in surgical services?
A lot of changes happened for the people of surgical services. Our PACU was actually turned into an isolation unit. So the people that were that were being tested for COVID ended up being in that unit. It was able to be a closed unit. They were able to change the pressure to negative pressure. So our PACU was taken over as an isolation unit for these COVID patients. So what happened with that, of course, as you can imagine, is then you have to figure out, along with facilities or whomever your incident commander is how are you going to route the traffic? How are we going to do this and minimize the traffic? How are we going to protect our staff? How are we going to protect our patients? How do we get to where we need to go and still maintain that, traffic flow that's so important in surgical services? So we had, at the hospital where I just finished up my assignment, we had a very good incident commander, and a very good infection preventionist. And so we walked the route with them, also with the ER director. We all got together, very cohesive group of people, and we walked that together and talked about the scenarios. What does that mean for surgical services? What does that mean for bringing patients to the OR? What does it mean for bringing patients out? Where do we take our COVID positive patients? How do we do that? So those are all sorts of things that we had to look at. And then we actually were fortunate enough to have a separate area that was we called it our PACU 2. It had less beds, but we were able to take then our surgical patients, which of course decreased drastically in numbers, but we were able to recover them in our PACU 2 section that was totally sealed off, totally separate from PACU 1. So that's one of the things. When I left, Friday was my last day at that assignment. When I left there, we were doing maybe 2 or 3 cases a day, and those were cases that were deemed to be absolutely necessary to be done. So, and we had not done any COVID patients, any surgery on COVID patients, but there was absolutely a process in place for that. So a lot of changes came up related to that, educating the staff, trying to make sure that we communicated, and we can talk about that certainly. How do you support the staff? I know that's one thing maybe we could talk about as well.
Yeah, that would be where I would go next, but I just want to back up 1 second. When you were doing this whole renovation piece and redeploying the PACU resources, who were your key stakeholders that you brought into the group discussion that really added value?
The people that we brought in were the ER director, because our ER was very closely associated with our PACU. It was probably, I don't know, I would probably have to guess, maybe 300 feet, maybe a little bit further than that. It was across a big hallway. So our ED kind of fed into our PACU, if you will, and also into our pre-op area, which is very well laid out. So we had the ER director, we had the actually cardiovascular services director, because she used that PACU 2 a lot. And then also she was greatly impacted by this COVID crisis because there are a lot of surgeries now, a lot of procedures that they can't do. We got staff involved in it. We got the charge nurses involved in it. We got the infection preventionist. We got the incident commander, the manager of the ER. Those are just some people that come to mind. And we wanted to get the staff's input because they were going to be the ones and are the ones that are going to transport those patients from the OR to PACU 2, and then also from pre-op to the OR. So we had to figure out a way to do that safely and protect them, also protect our patients.
Oh, very good information. Thank you. So let's go back to where you were touching on before, and that's the staff, right? So I have so many concerns with the staff. Not only do we, they're working, 6 days a week, 14, 15-hour shifts. They're soon going to start breaking down.
Yeah.
But laying on top of the pressure of, the extended work hours and the fear of the unknown, the fear of, we hear all the stories about not having PPE and, being protected and doing things that we would never have thought of before, such as reusing masks. And
right.
So all of this is counterintuitive to everything that we have learned. And now you are, as the leader, standing up and saying, it's okay. We have to reuse this. So any insight into, what you did with staff to help them through this? But then that additional layer, we all know that OR nurses, they don't go out to the floors and manage patients. They haven't, had recent experience, most of them generally, haven't had recent experience administering medications and, doing that bedside care. And
Right.
so they're already feeling, vulnerable with that as well. So you lay on the complexity of the virus, the uncertainty of how you practice and how that's all changed. And now they're in a new environment. How do we support them in this?
It's very difficult. And as we talked about before, the humanity of healthcare for me goes so much to the staff members. It's huge with the families and with the patients, and I've been on both sides of it. I would much rather be on the staff side and the management side of it than be the patient or be the family member, certainly. But having experienced both of those gives me maybe a little bit different perspective about it. And you're talking about being at the elbow. I call it being in their ear. It's the same thing. It's that communication part of it and being able to read the body language of the staff, because body language goes immensely to emotional intelligence. And as a leader, we need a large degree of emotional intelligence so that we can be able to read our staff members, read our patients, read their family members, and understand what's going on. Some things you can't even put into words. And so being able to communicate with them both verbally and then non-verbally, being able to read them both verbally and non-verbally, to me is a big deal. Some of the things that we did as leaders as we were going through this COVID and certainly they're still going through this COVID crisis, is to make sure that we communicate. As the leadership did with us, the C-suite did with us, we would have 2 meetings a day. And so we would have our morning meeting to talk about what happened overnight. We would also have our afternoon meeting to talk about what then would happen the next day or the rest of the day. They also had at the hospital where I just was, Tiger Text, which is HIPAA compliant texting, which I had never used before, but it was really good. So they used that for leadership. So some of the things that we can do for our staff are some of the things we can do are to make sure that we communicate both in person with them. And you talked about visibility. I absolutely agree with you. We cannot be too visible during this crisis, and making sure that the people know that we care, not just in the time of crisis, but also in the time where there's not a crisis. And that's where you build your relationships. And to me, all of this is about a relationship. If you have a relationship with your staff, that will take you a long way in the things that you do during a crisis time. So making sure you're building those relationships ahead of time. But right now we're in the middle of a crisis. So we've got to make sure that we're visible with them, that we're talking to them. When we know something, that we're telling them what it is. Some things we don't want to have to say, some things we don't want to have to share. But it's imperative that we do. Certainly if it's not appropriate to share, then we don't do that. But most things in my experience, certainly with this, are appropriate to share, and they need to know. And they're either going to hear it on TV, they're going to see it on Facebook, they're going to see it somewhere else. So if we can get ahead of that curve, then it's going to help us in the long run and even in the short term. We also would do things for people who were not there very often, because we called them per diem, but I also call them PRN staff. Then for those folks, if you have an email chain, but also what I really meant to say was a text message chain. So if you have a text message chain that you can send out with updates, that can be very soothing to your staff members. You don't want to include anything certainly that's not HIPAA compliant, and you have to be aware of what you're sending out. But those increased text messages, if your staff do not mind communicating that way, can really go a long way with that. We would have an area, we had a thing called a huddle book. So information that we would get, we would put in the huddle book, and they read that every morning in their huddles. You could also post it on bulletin boards. I had a friend who was a director of radiology, and she had a whole COVID board. So she said, look, if there's anything that you want to know about COVID, here are the emails, here's the information, here's what I have today. In addition to talking with them one-on-one, she also posted it so that people could see that. And then we also talked a little bit about email. So I think communication, you really during these times cannot be visible enough, and you cannot communicate enough.
Yeah, that's great. I love those tips. And I think that people will really find a lot of value in the practicality of that text messaging chain. I think that people respond to that. It's real-time information, and they likely feel as though they're connected, but they don't have to get so engrossed and involved in phone calls and things like that. So that's a really good strategy. The next thing I want to talk and shift gears a little bit, as you and I had spoken before, and in addition to me being an experienced perioperative leader, I'm also a mind-body medicine practitioner. And like you talked about that sixth sense, you talked about that body language, you talked about that emotional intelligence, and we embody stress, and we have this response. It influences how we make decisions. It influences our health. All of this compounds over time. Do you have any personal strategies or things that you could share about how you manage stress as a leader? Because right now people are coming to us for all the answers, and we don't have them all. And if we have them in the morning, like you mentioned, they're different in the afternoon. And so how do you manage through this as a leader?
Part of it for me is to recognize on a daily basis, and not in the middle of a crisis, but even not in the middle of a crisis, that what we do in perioperative services is not normal. It is not normal to bring people in and cut them open and to operate on them and then sew them back up and to see the things that we see. That is not normal. Is it necessary? Absolutely. Is it healing? It absolutely is. But I know that we don't think about that in a conscious sense. We don't think about that in a conscious sense, to realize the stress that takes on us every single day. And I've talked about this with staff, I've talked about it with other leaders. What we do is not normal. It is healing. Again, it is necessary, but we need to acknowledge within ourselves that this inherently is stressful. And we know that it's stressful because of some of the reactions that we get from some of our colleagues, whether they're physicians, anesthesia providers, peer-to-peer, bullying in the OR. The Joint Commission came out in 2008, I think it was, or 2009, with the Sentinel event on disruptive behavior. All of this goes into the stress that we deal with on a daily basis. So you take that stress and then you put something like COVID on top of it, and it just amplifies it. So some of the things that have been helpful to me is to realize and acknowledge what we do is not normal. What we do is very important, however, for our patients. Nobody wants to have surgery. Even in labor and delivery, which I've not worked in, but certainly I've had 2 children, even in labor and delivery, the people that work there, that's generally a happy place, but it can end up not being a happy place depending on what happens with the mother and the baby. The same thing in surgery. We consider it to be, as staff, sometimes it's minor surgery, and I can tell you from experience, it's minor unless it's on me or unless it's on a family member. So we need to recognize the stress and recognize the signs of stress that we deal with on a daily basis. For me, during this COVID crisis, I've realized that I am come home more tired than I was before. And I recognized that because I would come home and I wasn't physically tired. It was an emotional tiredness from trying to make sure that we communicate with the staff, that they have what they need for protection, that our patients have what they need. And so for me, it meant that I would come home and I had to recognize that I needed more rest, I needed more sleep. And some of the things, and I talked to the staff about that. While I could get more sleep, some of my staff cannot sleep. I mean, they're awake because of this and because of the anxiety surrounding this. So some of the things that I've had to do to figure out how to deal with the stress is to be able to talk to the staff and acknowledge with them the anxiety and the fear that they're experiencing. And I absolutely understand that. The other part of that is to realize that I have to plan how I'm going to eat. And I have to plan my, I call it eating right, but I have a plan for that. And if I ignore that, then I'm not going to eat the way I need to eat. I'm not going to eat healthfully. I'm not going to be able, and our cafeteria where I was did not have the resources at the time to be able to provide what everybody needed, the healthy things that everybody needed. So they were encouraging people to bring their lunch, so that they could plan certainly for that, certainly for people who were there at night and 3 to 11 and the people that would work 11 to 7. So I think planning into how you deal with your stress is very helpful for me. Talking to my peers, not just to the people that report to me, but also talking to my peers and acknowledging with my peers, this is a very difficult time for all of us, and supporting one another through that, and recognizing again that humanity that goes with it. We are stressed. We are tired. The staff, as you mentioned, are having to do things they haven't either they've never done or they haven't done in many years. And that's very uncomfortable for them. So that's some of the things that I've had to look at in myself and realize, what I needed to do to help take care of myself and also to help take care of the people that I work with.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really great point, that acknowledging just goes a long way, right? Because it is the reality. You can't change that reality, but bringing it forward and into the light for people to talk about it is really an essential step. And so that's critical. And the role modeling of a leader and role modeling of self-care translates to staff is that they feel as though they can take those liberties to care for themselves and things like that. Have you seen any unique initiatives in any of your healthcare organizations that you visited that are specific for real-time stress management, such as meditation rooms, quiet spaces, silent dining rooms, things like that? Have you noticed any of that in your travels?
I wish I could say I had. Honestly, I haven't, and I would love to see more of that. I tend to rejuvenate with silence. And I learned that a long time ago. That was something I also learned from my dad, because he was the same way. So I know that, when I have downtime, it needs to be quiet, because there's so much going on during the day and so many people talking to you and so many stressful interactions that my downtime just has to be quiet. But I wish I could say that there were places in the hospitals that I've seen where those things could be provided. I haven't had that opportunity to see that, but I would love to see more of that. I would tell you one thing that does come to mind. Wasn't particularly in the hospital environment, but the community really rallied around this hospital. It's a community hospital. And so they would put things on their Facebook page, and they would say, the community was saying, what can we do for you? So of course you can't go out and, your family members can't go out and eat. You can't go out and socialize with one another. But a lot of the places would cater things in. Restaurants would bring things in. We had a juice bar that brought in juice. They would bring in, you've seen the little things for health shots. The little health drinks, the little health shots. They brought those in. They had quite a few things like that in the community that they did for the staff there, and they were very, very appreciative. And they let that be known. That's another thing. Just let your staff know that you appreciate them. Community was very good about letting them know and recognizing what they were doing for them and their community. So those were some of the things that were very encouraging to the staff.
Yeah, oh, that's really good to hear. I love that, bringing health shots to the staff, right?
Yeah, they did. It was great.
Pizza and donuts, and but the health shots, that's a really good strategy. So
yeah,
great. Well, as we start to wrap up this interview, is there anything, any lingering thoughts that you would like to share, or things that we haven't covered that you feel would be of great value for people to hear from you?
I think that the thing to remember is this is a very difficult time, and we know that it is. However, we also know that if we pull together, we will get through this. We absolutely will get through this. It is a matter of time. It is a matter of pulling together. Do we have all the resources that we'd like to have? We don't. Is that stressful? It is. And so acknowledging that and moving forward with it, but also, sometimes people can get lost and they can start to circle the drain. And we all know in healthcare what it means to circle the drain and what happens when you circle the drain. So what we need to do is to, as leaders, to remind our staff, yes, this is where we are right now. This will not last forever. As with anything that is difficult in life, we just have to live through it. And we have to pull together through it. And we will get on the other side of it. We absolutely will get on the other side. It's just a matter of time. And if we can pull together and be kind to each other, and sometimes that may be an overused statement, but be good to each other, be kind to each other, be cognizant of what your peer and what the people that you work with are going through, it goes a long way. And so we will get through this. We absolutely will. It's just a matter of time and pulling together.
So Kathy, thank you so much for wrapping up all those last minute lingering thoughts and pulling it all together and sharing all those pearls of wisdom. I really appreciate how you're supporting this project and as we work towards the greater good of supporting our community during this pandemic. I think they'll find a lot of value in what you've brought to the table, and especially that humanistic approach and how essential it is to bring that into whatever we do as leaders. So thank you again so much for your time.
You're very welcome. And thank you, Peg, for your time. This has been a pleasure to be able to speak with you and to share with our peers the things that we're learning as we go along. And I really appreciate your time and Whitman Partners' time in putting this together. I really think it'll make a big difference and encourage each other as we go along. Thank you.
Great. Okay, and I look forward to seeing you, as we say, on the other side when all this settles out and we're in our new models and systems and how we're working. So thank you again, and be safe and take care.